All right. Well, we're heading into for me out here in California, the morning phase of our 24-hour marathon of participatory budgeting, and we're learning and growing so much by listening to practitioners, to researchers, to academics, and to thought-provoking people. And I'm excited to talk about Don Waisanen, who is here, and I think he qualifies on all of those dimensions. He is a professor, but he's also he's been a participant. He's been a thought leader. We've talked on the phone. He's challenged my thinking. He's a published author about participatory budgeting. So he brings a really unique perspective from direct lived experience. And I'm really excited about his talk. I don't exactly know what he's going to say, which is partly why it's exciting. But I'm very thankful that he's here. So Don, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Luke. Thanks for joining this morning, everybody. So this is Real Money, Real Power, the challenges with participatory budgeting in New York City. I'm going to give you an overview of a year-long project we did in New York on participatory budgeting and a lot of the challenges we found around this. So all of the things we found will be geared toward what can we do to improve participatory budgeting in any setting, not just the one that we were within. So what I want to do, I want to start with a big picture, actually. I want to rise up because I think when you're affiliated with participatory budgeting, when you think about the subject, it's very easy to get into the weeds too quickly. So I want to back up for everybody, right? And here's a core premise I want to start with, just for our era in general. More weight is being put on communication than ever before, and that's in and across organizations and throughout societies. Let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by this. So we go back, let's say 500 years ago. Most people in most places in the world were living in small villages, small towns. You didn't really venture out very much, right? You didn't go to other places too much. There was travel, but it was minimal for most people in the world, right? So you got to know people really, really well, perhaps too well, more well than you wanted to. But you lived in this little village, so you kind of knew everyone. There's a lot of things you could assume about other people living in this kind of environment, right? You knew that Jeff over there, the blacksmith, he would make iron all day, and maybe he's a little grumpy sometimes. And right, Jennifer over there is very skilled with the farming, and right, you kind of assume a lot of things, right? Fast forward, here we are, 2021. There's a great book out there called Culture on Demand that's all about this by James Lull. More people across the world are coming into contact with more people than ever before in human history. And you can't assume as much about other people, right? This requires the work of communication to perform many functions for us in and across societies. Most people are strangers to each other in this world. So in this environment, we have to think a lot about the work that communication is doing for all of us. This is why, frankly, many organizations figured out over time that the rigid bureaucratic structure in which they're engineered is perhaps not well suited to this current day and age, right? Just the silos of information that take place in rigid bureaucracies up on that top left-hand side there, the lack of information between different parts of an organization isn't adequate to meet the demands and the tasks of diverse people needing to work together in an organization. So organizations have been playing with structures, right? There's matrix organizations over there with very kind of loose, porous boundaries between teams. Go down there, project organizations where you might have a team lead and leads within that. But again, opening up the boundaries and making them porous between different parts of an organization is critical. There's loosely coupled organic networks. And these are just some examples of organizations themselves, corporate organizations, nonprofits, government agencies, even discovering that they need to have more channels of communication and less rigid structure overall. One example of this is the late Tony Shea of Zappos, right? He created he didn't create, but going off of Brian Robertson's work on something called holacracy, which is a very kind of democratic decision-making structure within an organization. When he was running his company, had this format where there was kind of flexible organizational structure. There were new meeting formats. Many of you may have heard of things like the stand-up meeting. Everybody come to a meeting, you have to stand up. We're done with the meeting when we get through everything. And when you're standing up, you're more impelled to try to, get through things maybe a little bit quicker, cut out the silences a little bit, things like that. More autonomy to teams and individuals, and also unique decision-making process. I'm hoping you're already starting to make the connections with participatory budgeting here. But this is big picture stuff. And I think we have to start here to really think about how to do participatory budgeting well. Fast forward to the present. Where are we now? COVID-19. Life has been upended for 15, 16 months at this point. And I would argue that COVID-19 has only brought more weight to this premise that communication carries so much in our era in terms of the work that needs done in bridging differences, building trust, helping people engage in good decision making versus the kind of older structures that were a little bit more intuitive and off the cuff, and people were by and large excluded a lot. Not a lot of thought going into how the decision making process brings us together or can tear us apart. So 2020, this is my visual representation of that entire year leading through the present. Now I'm fully vaccinated, thank goodness, and moving forward a bit, as many of us are. But what a year that was, right? And these are my 3 kids. They're adorable, love them. But we were all home for like almost an entire year. Just this last week, I think was the first time in 15 months that I've had all 3 kids out of the house. Bless you, summer camp. Thank you so much, right? Finally got them out. But we're all on top of each other, all in this environment. And so 2020 just felt a little bit like that overall. And I know you can relate. So why bring this up? Well, we're all sitting at home. We're all in the digital world like we are in this conference. Things have increasingly gone into the digital. And as we go into the digital world, the sense of immediacy, the sense of nonverbal connection, identification with other people, presence is a variable we talk a lot about in communication as important, goes away a bit, right? We lose those ties are a little bit looser or much looser in a digital environment. And just to share with you, I've been loving watching these. This is a New York City Council meeting via Zoom, right? And I go into these, I'm actually less concerned what they're talking about at times. I'm just looking at like bodily behavior and how people are checking in and out and who's talking and who's not. And these often follow that kind of very linear structure we know about for decision making. You talk, then you talk, then you talk, versus there's ways we could play with the format, have people talking simultaneously to each other. Lots of changes we could make. So some genius broke the internet by taking Maslow's hierarchy of needs and putting, I think appropriately, Wi-Fi on the very bottom. We had a little rolling blackout last week, and my internet was down for 2 days, and it felt like a bit like this. All right, so Conrad and Poole say increasingly being able to recognize, diagnose, and solve communication-related problems is vital to the success of people in even the most technical occupations. That isn't just a matter of speculation. There's the National Bureau of Economic Research report, which I found fascinating from just a few years back, showing that nearly all job growth since 1980 has been in occupations that are relatively social skill intensive, while jobs requiring high levels of analytical and mathematical reasoning, but low levels of social interaction, jobs that are comparatively easy to automate, have fared comparatively poorly. This is incredibly significant for something like participatory budgeting, where we're talking about, we're really doing both. We want people to do the work of analysis and decision-making, but we've got to do this together. The social skills, the decision-making skills, the structures by which we organize ourselves are more imperative than they've ever been, I would argue, at any time in human history. And we have the evidence to support that. So moving forward, let's finally get to participatory budgeting. Dropping down from that big picture that I think is so important, in New York City, a significant thing has happened. I know many of you know this. The city council decided just going a few years back now that they would allow citizens to spend up to $1 million on real projects in the city, following the incredible work that came out of Brazil originally and has transported around the world. I think this is the largest participatory budgeting project in the world to this point in terms of the discretionary spending allowed and the decision-making behind this. So I have a story to tell here specifically about this. And in the spirit of improving the weight we now need to put on communication throughout society. So I often think back, I don't know, I used to watch that TV show Supermarket Sweep growing up, and I think of that guy who filled his shopping cart with nothing but cheese. People have choices to make. They can make some interesting choices. Hopefully this could get worked out better, though, in a group via talking to neighbors, things like that. You're not just going to go out there and fill your cart with cheese. You're going to make better decisions when you're not rushing by yourself through these situations. And in New York City, we've seen that. We've seen money allocated to improving playground spaces and parks, right? We've seen libraries benefit significantly from this. This is the front facade of a library when they wanted to improve the appearance and the feel and the warmth of the environment. Some great uses of public budgets via citizen spending. We've seen things like improving bus timing access. So when you go stand for a bus, like on the subway system in New York, you can now see the minutes until the bus is coming, reducing that anxiety about if you're going to be late for work or not. So some terrific uses of all of this. In New York, and we know that participatory budgeting can play out in different ways, and that's going to be part of the point I make toward the end here about how to improve it. Perhaps we have done this in too many different ways. There needs to be experimentation, of course, but there's a little bit, maybe too much non-strategic thinking that goes around this sometimes that can hurt the process. So just to start with New York City, there's a designing of the process. There's a brainstorming of ideas phase. There's a developing proposals phase, a voting phase, and then a funding of winning projects. And I'm going to show you in a little bit more granular fashion how that has played out in New York. So we first of all would ask my co-author and I on this project, it's been about a year on this. We were interested in New York City's claims of real money, real power. But we want to know, what does real money mean in this context, right? Because my co-author on what I'll show you is the eventual book here, Daniel Williams, he's an expert in public budgeting. So he was much more attuned to this than I am. I'm more in the space of civic engagement and communication. He said, you know what? When we look at this, it's about $40 million out of a $40 billion budget, capital budget, or $130 billion in the combined capital expense budget. So that's about 0.03 of the city's annual budget, or about roughly 16% of the council members' discretionary capital budget. So already, when we started off with this, we were thinking like, is this real money? That was a big claim in the ads and subways, posters. You can see it everywhere. Also, what does real power mean in this context? To give you an example, each council member who takes part in participatory budgeting commits to the use of 20% of their allocated discretionary capital funds for participatory budgeting, reserving 80% for other purposes. And my co-author with other authors actually published a separate study showing that overall, council members don't really change the categories of their allocations. So that was these were just some little sparks initially of like, we should explore this. We should get into it, almost like investigative journalists. We should go find out what's happening out there. That's my co-author, Dan. He's not here today, but I like to call this picture Happy Dan. This was us before we started this project. Went, okay, we're going to go into New York City, see all the fantastic things participatory budgeting was doing. We were pretty celebratory about the whole thing. And we thought, when we go out there, here's what we're going to see. We're going to walk into this, New England town hall type setting and see people in a community voting for things that matter to them, projects that they're most concerned about and want to fund. The reality, however, though, was it looked much more like this. We would walk into meetings and see this kind of thing happening with these kind of people. We'll talk about that too. So after that, this is this is sad Dan. That's about as sad as he gets. He's a pretty nice guy. But we went to several participatory budget meetings in New York City and felt a little deflated after this and decided to start digging into all of this further. So we asked ourselves, first of all, is this real power, or is there maybe co-optation also going on? Meaning, are there power interests and other things going on? People in the community who are kind of gaming the system, perhaps? I don't really know, because there's just not a lot of widespread participation that we're seeing. So questions we started asking, and this formed the basis for our book. Does participatory budgeting share power with the least advantaged community members? I'm going to give you some examples of that a little later. I think we've got some good answers to those questions. Interest groups. What's the role of interest groups in participatory budgeting? I think as it's been conceived in most places around the world, we don't tend to think of things like interest groups when we think of this novel, wonderful process that can be put in place to help people with thinking about how things are funded. Experts, this is really key, right? And this goes back to long-standing themes in literatures on deliberative democracy. What is the role of experts? And we see that playing out every day in the news right now, right? With coronavirus has been kind of probably one of the main themes of the past 15 months. What role should experts have in public decision making? And we see both a lot of support and a lot of resistance for expertise. But at other times when experts, maybe people substitute their judgment, right, for those of the residents. And then clientelism. Does participatory budgeting in New York City negate or reflect clientelism and those kinds of practices? Where
could you define that word? Because for me, it's a new word and I don't know if I understand it properly. And I want to make sure I know what you mean by clientelism.
Yeah, there's various ways to define this, but mostly we could think about it in a kind of quid pro quo way. Someone comes along, even government agencies or actors or people being at the voting booths and things like that. Just kind of expectations for reciprocity, that because I'm doing this service for you, here's something that I'm looking for. There's a lot of ways to define it. Just think about it, mostly like kind of quid pro quo type of politics that can manifest in different ways. You give and receive. It makes the process a little less pure.
And this is something that has come up in the home and family dinners. We often wonder what the difference between quid pro quo and bribery is.
Yes.
And so like we're often at a loss of like, wait, was that or was that? Like, how do you make a distinction between some of these gradations? Because of course there is, our genetic, from our ape DNA, if you will, there is a notion of when someone does something for you in behavioral economics, you do feel encumbered at some level to be nice to them or do something back. So when does it become, and maybe you'll talk about it later, but to me, this is a fascinating part of your work.
Yeah. And I think the way that I approach that is we find that out in context, right? Not through surveys where people can potentially hold off their true opinions. By going in and being a participant observer in participatory budgeting, by asking people questions, certainly things like that, but trying to look at all of these questions together rather than in isolation, I think we can come up with good answers to that. I'm less interested in clientelism by itself in participatory budgeting. I'm more interested in the potential for it in light of these other issues. So I'll show you what that looks like in context in just a little bit here. So in New York, participatory budgeting, number of ways this could work, but the way it works there is about 2 months where there are neighborhood assemblies where people come together and identify community needs and select delegates. And I'll just tell you all right off the bat, when we started getting into this, these were sometimes hard to find. It wasn't clear what was going on. There was maybe like a poster up by a library with an arrow pointing one way, but you weren't sure what room it was going to. And right, just even at this initial phase, this can get tremendously confusing to people. And confusion should be the forbidden emotion in all of this, right? We want people to have joy about this. We want them to sometimes be frustrated and have a need to want to allocate budgets in certain ways. But confusion, I feel like we should just wipe out from all aspects of the process, period. The less confusing, the better. Then there's delegate meetings. And this is where things get tricky too, we found out. Delegate meetings are where local people will come to represent and advocate for various, you got 10 items on the list: the playground, the traffic lights need fixed, and put all these things. Oh, the trees need little like dresses around them. They have this in New York City where you want to protect the base. You don't want animals peeing on it, so it destroys the tree. The level of stuff that we often heard, right? and delegates will come in and it's almost like representative democracy at that point. People will try to self-delegate, they'll nominate others, but this distills the process further. There's these project expos where proposals are shared and there's community feedback. Then there's the community votes in March, and then implementation and monitoring of projects after that. Give you some ideas of just materials we picked up. This is one like this, right? You would show up at a meeting and say, well, okay, what's your ideas? Location, you put your name in, you might put it into a box, goes into the mix. The delegates would sift through these and talk about them. And then there's dedicated websites for these too. So, there's the overall New York City Participatory Budgeting site. And thankfully, in 2018, there actually was a New York City Civic Engagement Commission started to help this process along and to create less confusion, things like that. And then districts themselves, council members will have their own participatory budgeting sites as well, not always linked to that main site, not linked to city council things, but just to try to understand this, some council members, some local affiliates have taken it on themselves to try to represent their districts and what's going on. And they all look quite different. That's a clue to where we're going with this. Here's an example of how ideas were generated and sifted at a neighborhood assembly. You can see the kind of dot voting. I think many of you are probably familiar with. We got them up there. Okay, you got 2 dots, put them up. Okay, let's talk through each of these from there. And but then we found that, and the reason I have this blacked out, you're not missing anything here, is some delegate meetings we discovered were closed or inaccessible to the public. This was our first big moment. We tried to get into a delegate meeting and we're gonna hang, and we were prevented from doing so. I believe at this, if I remember, the city council members level said that this was not going to be accessible. There needed to be closed delegate meetings. We found this fascinating. Like, why would this be closed? This is this is public money. So we found just different practices going on, and we human beings love to invent rules that don't exist in situations too. 20 years of studying communication, it's one of the things one of the things I most teach is there's real rules and policies in a situation, but people will also come to situations with their own rules, right? I train public speakers sometimes, and people come with this idea of like, I'm not good at public speaking, I'm not creative. They make up rules in their head that they apply to themselves. And I use that as kind of a anecdote analogy here for in participatory budgeting and things like it, there's this potential for people to really invent rules that don't exist too. So the more open, ambiguous room there is for interpretation, and get back to this confusion theme again, the more people could just be making things up at the local level as well, and this could go awry. So I want to show you, we collected data on participatory budgeting from other media sources, about 1,500 or so. We just wanted to find all the discourse we could about how people think about this, the messages they're communicating about it, just to try to understand this better. And this is the kind of schedule that we would see and tried to have both ourselves and graduate assistants participate in. This was from Saturday, April 6th, one year, different times when there would be voting in the cycle, broadcasted to various publics. So I want to now distill all this down and give you just some examples of just general themes from all of this, and then let's talk for a bit. I think we're good on time. The reasons why participatory budgeting's potential is hindered in New York City, we found there's too many to talk about here, so I'm just going to highlight some main ones in red. Really big theme, probably the core theme, is that the budget delegate process, you could have a great participatory budgeting process, but at any one stage, if it's not accessible to people who are disadvantaged, and by that we mean the barriers that we even found out from people themselves they face. They got to work evening shifts. I have no childcare, don't know about this process in the first place, or not being selected by the council member's office. This isn't an exhaustive list. At any phase, if it's not accessible to people who have any kind of barriers to the process, the whole process, we believe, can really collapse, right? Versus keeping that accessibility, that equity throughout the process, finding mechanisms for that to happen is utterly critical. Budget delegates in some districts were dominated by government employees. So Luke earlier wanted to talk about clientelism, right? This is probably, this edges into that area, as well as the role of experts, the role of power, the role of special interest, all of the above, right? And we found this fascinating. Now, people do need to come to participatory budgeting as citizens in society. You're in a local district, but over and over again, we kept asking ourselves, who is here, who is participating, and why? What are they saying, right? And we found this pretty fascinating. I'm going to go forward to a few more. Let's just look at the ones in red. Delegates were far more successful than others in seeing their proposed projects reach the ballot. We found that over and over again. And I'm going to show you a difference between where we did some sort of post hoc interviews and surveys after voting took place. I'll show you the numbers just a moment. We did find that, this was a big theme, difference between the delegates and people who came to vote. Okay, few other things here. Volunteers at pop-up balloting locations advocated for their projects while officiating at voting locations. So here you are, you show up. I mean, can you imagine in a general election, especially given all that's happened this past year, the kerfuffle nationally around this issue, if the person running this was advocating for a candidate, for instance, while also engaging in the process. And in a way, what we observe, we're not blaming these folks. We're just saying that the potential for this is not only very concerning, but reflects that maybe there's too much going on at the same time, right? I got to do this, but I got to help this person. They don't understand this issue. They need information. So more thought about that kind of part of things. Who's help running the process and who is there, to maybe take care of some of these other things could be critical. Maybe there just needs to be like I was at the airport a few weeks ago and just, the information kiosk kind of thing. Here's just the information person. That's it. And, they present information almost like those nonpartisan voter guides, something like that. All right, let's do a few more. Council offices fail to answer questions about their process for making decisions. We found this over and over again. This was very concerning, given that there's $1 million at play and real money, real power is the slogan being espoused. But over again, sometimes it was just not knowing what was going on, but failing to answer questions, basic questions, was an issue. We found that voters questioned the validity of cost estimates, but there was no audit of cost estimates, and cost estimates are not detailed. So there was a lot of skepticism around how much does something cost. We're going to we're asking to put in a new sidewalk ramp at a certain location near a park in New York City, but not a lot going on in terms of like how much is that, and right, and then no follow through after. There wasn't like after the year of implementation. Not easy for people to find, well, how much was actually paid for that? Who gave the services? It's a thicket of questions raised just around cost estimates and how much things cost. A few more, let's just do the ones in red again. Some city agency representatives to the delegate process lobby for projects rather than neutrally provide information for decision-making, right? So again, that list of 4 questions we started with about the potential for this to go be awry, really, this was a very concerning thing where you got local representatives showing up and, this wasn't totally in the citizens' hands. Let's put it that way. They were nudged, if you want to be generous, towards certain projects rather than others across the boroughs of New York City. Okay, one more here, then I'm going to give you some examples of these things that we've been talking about. A lack of coordination between districts was really big, right? And not really having a central information site. So you saw that main participatory budgeting site in New York City up front there, and then the sort of spin-off sites that weren't really connected to it. Yeah, there was a main site, but it's not like that main website was really used to funnel information to be a mechanism for making choices, for being an inventory of what happened within each of the districts. So this was absolutely the central finding of our book. There are as many different participatory budgeting programs in New York City as you can imagine. There wasn't one, although it's espoused as one in practice on the ground. When you get down to how people did things, what they did, we were looking at many different types of participatory budgeting projects that were not aligned in both theory and practice, which contributed a lot to citizen confusion. That one of, oops, sorry. Okay, so we wanted to ask, does participatory budgeting share power with the least advantaged community members? And we asked, this was interviews of folks after they had voted in the cycle. So around April or so, have they suggested projects this year, right? And we found differences. Just to go on to the second one is the important one. Is your project represented among the ones shown here, right? For those who were delegates in the process, 100% said yes. And this is a small n, but we had sort of seen this played out across districts, all the ones that we visited, and it didn't make it to the ballot. And then those who were not delegates, much less. And so it was clear, like, the delegates really do drive the issues in a really big way. And the concerns of people who might show up and not be delegates at the start of the process don't follow all the way through. So I want to go into some of the deliberations, just a little bit of the dialogue we saw reflected in some of these meetings. And one speaker, right, said, the question earlier about neighborhoods that are underserved and how do we ensure that they're represented? I just want to do a little poll in the room. Who's from neighborhood 1, the wealthiest neighborhood in the district? If you could raise your hand, right? Who's from, I don't know, right? Neighborhood 2, right? Okay, right. So speaker 5 says, just wanted to notice that at least half of the room is from this rich, wealthy district. I just wanted to name that and pay attention to that, which is a great thing, bringing that out. But we saw this going on a lot. Issues of the usual suspects being present and the implications of that for what got picked across these districts. This is a problem that participatory budgeting must deal with. Speaker 7 said, notify, we're not going out to underserved neighborhoods to highlight their problems. People need to come to the committee with their ideas. So this was, this was part of the thinking, worked out in some places. It wasn't that people were not unreflective about this issue. What's the role of interest groups? We found some responses mentioned advocates, generally reflecting school system-based advocacy. This was probably the biggest thing in New York, was just the amount of attention to schools, and perhaps rightly so. But listen to this. One person told us, the school that my daughter's in, the PTA is very active, so there's the reason I wanted to vote. We learned that an administrator at a child's school asked to vote for renovation of a bathroom, repeatedly asked parents to please vote. So clientelism, a little bit of quid pro quo. Is this bribery? I don't think it's bribery, but there is some inbuilt expectations we saw develop for we will listen to what an administrator of a school might want and perform into that, perhaps, right? On top of that, let's see, experts, particularly those employed by the city, do they seek to substitute their judgment for those of the residents? I'll give you a little snapshot here. Speaker 2 at one of the meetings said, is there any way to know what projects are in the existing plan? Parks has all the documents. They have a whole list of their website, and New York City park system is huge. It's this gargantuan thing, right? An agency within New York City government. Yeah, I wish they had that for us right now. And this was the key. If you want a water fountain in your park and there isn't one, the Parks Department is not going to see it that way. So that's what we have to find out. You're going to fight parks. Even when we go through this whole thing, they're going to say, no, 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 right? And we found there should be limits to where money can go and what can be done. But we found a lot of people were seeking to reduce their voices, not only with the presence of experts in a meeting, but for the anticipation that powerful government agencies would just knock down, people would just knock down what they say. So they should back up their expectations for what money should be spent on, right? And this kind of limiting, we could call it limiting mindset, but also just limiting sense of anticipation for how this works was big. So we have several recommendations for New York City participatory budgeting. And this really, I think you'll see, will translate to other places and times when it's used. I know, the efforts that FirstRoot is rolling out to get this right, to do this as well as possible. This is something that we should all be invested in. We've got too many from the book, but I want to give you some key ones and highlight them in green. This is really key. All proposals initially proposed should be added to an open access database so that no proposal can become just lost. Right from the outset, that proposals were lost, that there was a ton of different things going on between different districts, really minimize the potential for the process across this massive system in New York City. Few more. Cost estimates must be given in line item detail. Really critical, with where does it come from? How was that judgment formed? But this would also relate to the open access database, where centralized information can be found on spending. No city employee should be allowed to be a budget delegate. Really critical, right? A conflation in practice here and between roles. If they're going to take, if they can certainly take part in participatory budgeting, but the influence of a budget delegate as a representative of an area in advocating for proposals should be taken out of the process. No voting should be allowed at a facility that may benefit from a proposal. That's another key, right? So we would show up at a school and the issues would be school related. Of course, right? We're looking at the school from everything we know about nudge and, what Heath and Heath call shaping the path. We're so influenced by our environments, right? The feel of a room, the sounds, the smells, the way that the flooring is set up, are there arrows going in certain directions or not, all influence human judgment. And so let's take out that role of place in particular issues if we can. Okay, few more. Just do the highlights in green. The budget delegate stage of the process should be eliminated. Now, this is probably the most controversial one that Dan and I are recommending, but we saw far too much room for, and this may be overstating it, chicanery at this stage. Far too many secretive meetings, things like that, right? And far too much potential for one person to become pretty powerful, at the local level. And, like we saw in the post-hoc interviews, really make sure that things are seen through in terms of what they want from the end. So why not just simplify the process and cut that out? We don't even think it's needed, even for a big system like New York City. All right, we're almost done, folks. The mayor's office should require all city agencies to fully cooperate with the PB process. So if you're rolling this out at something like a city level, let's get really clear, right? One of the main things here, get really clear about what this is, what should be communicated. Almost, I would even bring in a branding agency to say, here's the message book for participatory budgeting. Here's the style guide, right? Almost like you might do for an organization. This is how we're doing it here. Can we amend it in the future? Absolutely. Here's the expectations for now, though. Okay, so that's our book, Real Money, Real Power, that we came out with just last year. Summarizes this whole project. If any of you are really into data and the numbers, it's all in there. I didn't want to get too much into the weeds just for the presentation purposes, but it takes you through that A to Z year that we went through with participatory budgeting. So I just want to say in conclusion, last thing here, and then let's talk for a bit. One of the problems of academia sometimes is that we're too focused on criticality. We like to critique, right? And I want to make sure that to let you all know that any critiques we had of participatory budgeting here were very much engineered in the spirit of improving overall practice, framework, theory, and we think that can be done. And it's funny that Luke brought up, I think, the session earlier with tech folks. I see tech as a major way through that and improving things. So this is all in the spirit of let's do this better and keep aiming higher and higher.
So one of the questions I have is that you seem to be presenting a paradox in the sense of people who are passionate about an issue shouldn't advocate for it because of potential clientelism and other aspects. So how can we structure the allowance of passionate advocacy in the world that because change doesn't happen unless there's unreasonable people demanding change to happen. So how can I be how can I be unreasonable in the future you envision for PB?
Yeah, I think the process has to allow for vigorous advocacy. It has to allow for singular points of view. The question is how much power at an early stage of the process should that be allowed to have amid competing views and the need to proliferate views, right? My concern is not you're the most passionate person in the world on a particular issue, but does that advocacy, does a participatory budgeting process open space for communication at that point, or does it close it down, right? Because often what's happening with vigorous advocacy, a person, let's just reduce it to this, right? Include those thoughts, have those thoughts move forward, have those ideas move forward, but at the same time, make sure the process is such that it's opening space rather than closing it down. And what we saw with this delegate process is it's not that these folks shouldn't have points of view. They absolutely should. It's that those points of view were funneled through a process that allowed them to get very single-minded too quickly. Does that make sense? There should be, I would love to think of the initial phase of participatory budgeting as being all about convergent thinking, right? We're opening outward. It's not exactly yes and all the time, but
but divergent thinking, you mean?
Sorry, divergent thinking.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Right.
Okay, great.
And
yeah,
the process,
we're in alignment on that with how we structure it in schools. And I just wanted to make sure that I heard you actually say that, because we find that, this notion of passionate advocacy is really critical to creating a certain kind of change in an environment, especially in the school environment. You can see, and I find this even in my own use of PB at some of the schools that we've done is, some kids are like, I kind of don't have an opinion of our school being better. I'm kind of, oh, you really care about that? Okay, I'll support you. And it feels actually healthy that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like you run the range from sort of apathetic to
I don't want to use the word apathetic. It's more like, my needs are met. I'm comfortable in my environment. But if you have something that's really important to you and you feel that there's a need that's not being met, I'm happy to support you.
Got it. Yeah.
And I don't think of that as apathy. It's because I think of apathy as checked out. It would be more expressed as, I don't care if I vote, or I don't want to vote, or you can have my vote, I just don't care. It's more of, oh, I've heard you. I see your passion. I'm willing to support you.
Yeah. Which can get people on board. Absolutely. And I don't think this should be reduced to civil discourse either, right? I mean, that's too limiting for allowing space for, first of all, if you can't even get your voice to the table, the civil discourse is too limited for that, right? You need to be boisterous, perhaps, to even create the space that's needed for an issue, right? I think this distinction between like great deliberation and great vigorous advocacy, that is a central thread for all of us to be following. People need that theorized, Luke. They don't understand, when is it I should be mad and protesting, and when is it that I should be sitting down and doing decision making, and what are the intersections between those two things? There's no politician out there who offers, a way of thinking about that well, and that I think we need to be thinking about those things in the context of participatory budgeting as well. But I think from a opening versus closing space for communication point of view, the process is critical.
No, I agree. I'm going to turn it over to the team or Karen or Sally Ann to see if there's any other thoughts and questions. I find it super fascinating about how to promote the advocacy. And we actually, for what it's worth, we actually have a small section that we try to teach the kids how to advocate. Like, here's language forms. Don't say something is cool, because cool is relative. try to use the word because.
Yeah.
Say this is important to me because of this, and give a because that people can either endorse or refute.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, that's putting a norm in place, right?
Right. All right. Clint or other people?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, I just wanted to start, Don, by saying thank you so much for coming and sharing this body of knowledge, because it, one, reinforces a lot of the things that we talk about on the team. We're constantly talking about transparency, and we're talking about transparency and like driving transparency into our product without necessarily, it's almost like we're chasing a ghost, right? We're like, we need this, we know we need this, because we don't, we're in a school, right? The fifth grade classroom didn't necessarily need heavy amounts of transparency, but the data that you're presenting, the experience that you're presenting in New York, just very clearly identifies, one, that in preparation for entering the civic level, we not only need to continue driving transparency, but also take it further, likely. So thank you for that, and I really appreciate you coming in and sharing that with us, because it takes the ghost away, right? I mean, now we actually have, we have more to work off of. I had a question specifically related to the environment of New York. I'm from Colorado. I didn't grow up in New York. Everything that I know about New York is, hearsay, and, but I do know, Chicago, New York, old cities with deep ties to, union, deep ties to, or past ties to organized crime, for that matter. There is this component where you come into this world and you say, well, this is how things get done.
Yeah.
Right. If, and those who could get things done learn to use and work within the system of how you get things done. Right. So now we bring PB in, and is it fair to maybe account for some of these as like it kind of got New Yorkified in a sense, but it's like we fit PB into an existing model.
Yeah.
That of New York, and then actually gave you the opportunity it actually gave you a looking glass to go, whoa, look at, like, this is how things naturally form within the civic world of New York. They immediately close off, people group together. They immediately, have we looked at it in have you looked at other cities at all and said, well, what we're seeing in New York, I don't want to say it can't happen elsewhere. Obviously it can happen anywhere, but is there components to it that are unique to the fact that, New York has this history of in culture within its civic work?
Yeah, Clint, it's a fascinating question, and we had given a bit of thought of this after the project. We thought a little bit more about this. I think for PB, there's such a wealth of data around it now. There's emerging research and evidence about what works and what doesn't work. I think what we could probably all do is rise to the level of this. Here's a framework, a way of doing it. We've thought through the specific components and procedures and practices that work really well just about everywhere, right? I think we can do that. I think that's possible. At the same time, it feels like whether it's a platform or a procedure or process through a website for PB, like there should always be room for, okay, where are we and what's going on here, right? And I think that's reflected in your question, because there's an irony in New York. Yes, there's all this old stuff there's machine politics, right, in the background. There's heavy union presence. at the same time, I just say it's a generalization, but New Yorkers, I've observed them for, decade, are a very activist people by and large. They're very engaged in their local issues. There's a sense of like, if something is wrong, let's fight for it, right? And so yes and no, right? There are those things, those systems and structures you see come up. Oh, Parks will say no, no, no. Well, the reason that person probably said that response is because they were busy trying to fight Parks on something, and so, yeah, I do think there is a component of this, and we're like, let's make sure we drop into scenes. Let's talk to people as much as possible. Let's listen, let's learn. Let's not presume the categories in advance of our research, especially. I do think there's something about that where you'd say, okay, the way that we roll out this PB technology can't exactly be the same in New York as it is in Austin, as it is in Tampa, right? And, there's maybe a list we could come up with of what those potential differences are too. Just think about the geography of New York. People are walking around, lots of public transportation. Well, what about somewhere in Alabama where there's absolutely none of that? And you're trying to get participation among people, right? There's no public buses. There's no, yeah. So.
It's a tough nut to crack, but I think that, we say this a lot on our team. It's like, if you solve the problem, if you solve the hardest of the problems, you've then solved the easier of the problems are solved for you, right?
Yeah.
You go in and you're able to build a system that can drive transparency through, San Pablo, right? Brazil, it'll probably, that solution will easily solve transparency issues in Denver, Colorado.
Yeah.
Right. So, I think that, again, thank you so much for this body of knowledge, because I know we'll be referencing and using it through time.
Yeah, and I think that the last thing I'm going to add is, some of what we're doing, Don, is we're designing systems and solutions to prevent the problem. And some of what we're doing is we're alerting teachers to have a very specific classroom discussion and teach civics and bring this up. Oh, okay, class, today's lesson is about corruption, clientelism, and advocacy. So, and we saw this earlier with Elizabeth Dudley, where, she's in the Academy of American Studies in Long Island City in Queens. And in her class, you not only had an assignment to create a proposal, you had assignments to review and comment on other people's proposals. And then the class would discuss, like, okay, what did you see? What's an appropriate comment? How do you, when are we building things up? When are we being critical? And so I think that the process in schools is, if it can be created in such a way that it's preparing for a better participant in a democracy, then we're coming out ahead, and letting them, sometimes the small budget is okay, because the small budget is a small mistake and we are going to be seeing mistakes. So maybe it's not so bad that some of the budgets are smaller in the school, because we know that the kids are going to make some mistakes. That's okay. It's kind of like when I decided that I wanted to teach my kids to drive, I got a beater, because, if they get into a fender better, not so bad.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. I think right now, I think we need to make larger, just all of us need to be making larger claims about the significance of this work. In rolling this out in schools, we need to be anchoring into the conversation right now. It's not really a conversation, it's a shouting match about CRT and 1619 Project 77. folks, these folks could benefit from anybody out there who's running a process, intended to help with decision making, to foster debate, dialogue, or deliberation. Because, I mean, we're modeling in schools things that should be going on in our civic life, but they're not, right? So
Right.
I don't know. I was on a national call yesterday with a bunch of folks just talking about this stuff, and I was thinking about participatory budgeting with it and going, the timing for this has just never ever been greater.
Yeah. John, thank you so much.